In 1963, a man in the town of Derinkuyu, in the volcanic heart of Turkey's Cappadocia region, decided to knock down a wall in the basement of his house. He was renovating, chasing some ordinary domestic problem, damp, cracked plaster, a room that never quite felt finished, and what he found on the other side of that wall was not a cellar or a cavity or a mistake in the original construction. It was a passage, cut straight into soft volcanic rock, leading downward into darkness, and when he and his neighbors followed it with lanterns they kept finding more, room after room, corridor after corridor, descending far deeper than anyone had reason to expect a house's basement to go. Local chickens, it turned out, had been mysteriously vanishing into gaps and cracks around the town for years, and now everyone understood roughly where they had been going. What that homeowner had stumbled into was one entrance among many into an underground city that, by the time archaeologists had properly mapped it, turned out to descend some 18 distinct levels beneath the surface, reaching a depth of roughly 60 meters, with some researchers arguing the true excavated extent goes even deeper than what has been formally surveyed. Estimates for how many people it could shelter at once run as high as 20,000, along with their livestock, their food stores, and everything else a community would need to disappear from the surface entirely and keep functioning for weeks or months at a time. None of this was visible from above. Derinkuyu, the modern town, had been sitting on top of Derinkuyu, the underground city, for generations, its residents walking to market and tending fields directly over a labyrinth that had, at some point in living memory, simply been forgotten. That's the part of this story worth sitting with before we go any further down. An entire excavated world, deep enough and large enough to hold a small city's population, existed directly beneath people's feet, and the knowledge of what it actually was, how far it went, what it had been built for, had slipped out of local memory so completely that finding it again required a man's basement wall and a plumbing problem. Cappadocia's volcanic landscape is riddled with caves, and locals had likely known about scattered rooms and shallow storage cellars for as long as anyone could remember. What almost nobody still living in 1963 seemed to grasp was the scale of what lay underneath, or that Derinkuyu was only one node in something very much larger. Word spread quickly once the extent of what lay beneath the town became clear, and Turkish archaeologists arrived to begin the slow, disorienting work of actually mapping a structure that had never been drawn on paper by anyone who built it. Surveying an 18-level maze cut by countless hands over countless generations, with no blueprint, no single architect's plan to consult, meant crawling room by room, corridor by corridor, sketching as they went, and even that first formal survey didn't come close to closing the book on the place. In the decades since 1963, archaeologists have periodically announced newly identified sections, previously sealed rooms, additional shafts, spaces that had been blocked off by rockfall or deliberate collapse long before anyone alive today was born, which means the map of Derinkuyu that tourists walk through now still isn't necessarily the complete one. To understand how a city like this could even exist, it helps to understand the ground it's carved from. Millions of years ago, a string of volcanoes across central Anatolia, Ursiai's chief among them, buried the region under repeated layers of ash and pyroclastic debris, which compressed over time into a soft, pale volcanic rock called tuff. Freshly exposed tuff is remarkably easy to work, soft enough to carve with basic hand tools, picks and simple chisels, yet it hardens on contact with open air, so a newly cut wall or ceiling stiffens into something structurally stable within days. That single geological accident is, in a very real sense, the whole reason Cappadocia looks the way it does above ground, with its famous cone-shaped fairy chimneys, and the whole reason a civilization with nothing more advanced than hand tools could plausibly carve a city 18 levels into the earth without the place collapsing on top of them. That same volcanic history is why the ground above Derinkuyu looks almost as strange as what's carved beneath it. Wind and rain have spent millennia eroding the softer ash layers away from harder capstones scattered across the surface, leaving behind the tall, cone-shaped pillars now known as fairy chimneys that make the wider Cappadocia landscape look, to most visitors seeing it for the first time, more like a painted backdrop than a real place people have farmed and lived in for thousands of years. The underground cities and the fairy chimneys above them are, in a real sense, two different expressions of the exact same geological gift, a landscape made of rock soft enough to shape by hand, in whichever direction, up or down, a given community needed to shape it. Once you're standing inside it, the engineering built around that soft rock gets genuinely startling. The complex is threaded by more than 50 vertical ventilation shafts, the deepest running some 55 meters straight down, doubling as wells that reached the water table and supplied drinking water that couldn't easily be poisoned from the surface by an enemy who didn't know the tunnels well enough to find the well shaft's actual position. Air moved through the entire underground network via this shaft system, keeping breathable conditions even many levels down, in rooms that never saw natural daylight, for however many days or weeks a family or a whole community needed to stay below. Fresh water and breathable air, solved simultaneously by the same vertical shaft, meant nobody had to risk a surface trip just to keep people alive during whatever crisis had sent them underground in the first place. That same rock also solved a problem no amount of clever door mechanisms could have fixed on its own, keeping food edible for weeks at a time. Tuff holds a remarkably stable temperature year-round, typically somewhere in the low teens Celsius regardless of the blistering Anatolian summer or the harsh winter overhead, which meant the deeper levels of the complex functioned as a natural refrigeration system, keeping stored grain, wine, and pressed oil from spoiling in a way that would have been impossible to manage in a surface storeroom exposed to the seasons. A community sealed underground for an extended stretch wasn't just hiding from danger, in other words, it was relying on the rock itself to keep its food supply viable for as long as the danger lasted. Defense was built into the architecture just as deliberately as survival was. At key choke points along the tunnels, massive circular stone doors, essentially disc-shaped millstones roughly 1 meter to 1.5 meters across and weighing several hundred kilograms each, sit ready to be rolled across the passage and sealed shut. Each one has a small hole bored through its center, just wide enough to fire a spear through or push food to whoever's sealed on the other side, and each one can only be locked from the inside, meaning anyone chasing the residents down a corridor would hit a solid stone wall with no way to force it open from where they stood. Corridors themselves run narrow and low, forcing anyone moving through them, friend or intruder, to stoop and walk single file, turning what looks like simple tunnel architecture into a defensive bottleneck that a handful of defenders could hold against a much larger force. Walking through those same corridors today, visitors tend to describe a very particular, almost physical sensation, the ceiling pressing lower with every few steps, the air noticeably cooler and stiller than it was at the surface entrance, sound behaving strangely in passages barely wide enough for one person, voices from other tour groups arriving muffled and directionless from somewhere that could be 1 level away or 3. Modern electric lighting and marked walkways make the experience navigable in a way it obviously wasn't for the people who first lit these same rooms with oil lamps, yet even now, with handrails and safety signage in place, it's easy to lose any real sense of how deep you've actually gone, or which direction leads back toward daylight. A disorientation that was almost certainly the entire point for anyone hostile who ever found their way in uninvited. The 18 levels weren't one continuous open space either, they functioned more like a stack of separately sealable neighborhoods, connected by steep stairways and additional shafts that could themselves be blocked off level by level if an intruder somehow got past the outer doors. Livestock stables tend to sit on the upper levels, closest to the surface, both for easier access when moving animals in and out and because animal waste and body heat needed decent airflow to stay livable. Deeper levels held storage, living quarters, and communal spaces, a layout that suggests whoever organized this space over the centuries was thinking carefully not just about hiding, but about how a functioning community, animals included, could keep itself fed, watered, and breathing for as long as the danger outside required. Keeping several thousand people, plus their animals, healthy in an enclosed space for weeks on end also demanded a level of sanitation planning that's easy to overlook until you actually stop and think about it. Waste from the stable levels had to be managed carefully enough not to foul the air the rest of the complex depended on, and the same shaft system that supplied fresh air and drinking water also appears to have helped carry stale, contaminated air up and out rather than letting it pool in the lower rooms. None of this survives as a tidy written manual explaining exactly how it was organized, but the layout itself, animals kept high near the airflow, waste-heavy activity separated from food storage and communal living several levels below, reads like the work of people who had learned, almost certainly through hard experience over generations, exactly what happens when a sealed underground community gets that balance wrong. And the danger, whatever specific form it took in a given century, clearly wasn't expected to pass in a single afternoon. The presence of wine and olive presses carved directly into the rock on certain levels tells you people weren't just crouching in the dark waiting to resurface. They were processing food down there, which only makes sense if they sometimes stayed long enough for a harvest's worth of grapes or olives to actually need pressing underground rather than above. Soot still darkens the ceilings of communal kitchen spaces, the residue of oil lamps and cooking fires burned for who knows how many collective hours across generations of use, in rooms where families would have cooked, eaten, and likely slept within a few meters of each other. Air thick with smoke that the ventilation shafts were built specifically to clear. Storage rooms and deep pits for grain appear throughout the complex, alongside stone tables and long carved benches clearly meant for communal eating rather than solitary survival. On one of the lower levels sits a cruciform chapel, a small church cut directly into the rock in the unmistakable shape of a cross, evidence that whatever community used this particular level, likely centuries after the tunnels were first begun, brought its religious life underground along with everything else. Nearby rooms, some researchers argue, functioned as a kind of missionary school, with adjoining chambers plausibly used for study or instruction, though how confidently that specific function can be assigned this far removed from any written record is genuinely up for debate. What isn't up for debate is the underlying message all of these features send together: this was never meant to be a brief hiding hole. It was meant to be, when necessary, an entire alternate version of daily life, held in reserve underground for as long as the surface stayed too dangerous to use. Who actually started digging all of this, and when, turns out to be a harder question than the scale of the place might suggest, mostly because soft tough never demands a single dramatic construction event the way, say, a stone temple does. The earliest excavation is generally credited to the Phrygians, an Indo-European people who dominated central Anatolia through roughly the 8th and 7th centuries BCE and who left their mark on the region's landscape elsewhere too, most famously in elaborate rock-cut monuments and facades at sites like Midas City. Further evidence of a culture entirely comfortable carving permanent structures directly out of living stone rather than building them up from separate blocks. At Midas City itself, carved facades tower above the surrounding plain in a style clearly meant to be seen and admired from a distance, which makes the underground cities an interesting mirror image of that same Phrygian instinct, the same willingness to treat solid rock as raw material to be shaped rather than simply built upon, only turned inward and downward instead of outward and up, toward concealment instead of display. The single clearest early written clue that something like this already existed comes from a Greek soldier and historian rather than from any Anatolian source at all. Xenophon, marching through the region in 401 BCE at the head of the 10,000, the Greek mercenary army whose retreat he later chronicled in the Anabasis, described passing through Anatolian villages where the local population lived below ground, entering their homes through a narrow opening at the surface not unlike a well mouth, climbing down by ladder into spaces shared, apparently without much ceremony, with their own livestock. Xenophon wasn't writing about Derinkuyu specifically, and scholars are cautious about drawing too straight a line between his account and any one excavated site, but the pattern he describes, entire households living below ground with their animals, accessed through a deliberately narrow surface opening, matches the underlying logic of Cappadocia's underground cities closely enough that historians treat it as meaningful supporting evidence for just how old this way of living in the region really was. A smaller, more speculative strand of scholarship pushes the origins back even further, into the 2nd millennium BCE and the era of the Hittite Empire, which controlled much of central Anatolia centuries before the Phrygians arrived. The case for a Hittite starting point is considerably thinner than the Phrygian one, resting more on plausibility, a sophisticated, highly organized state occupying exactly this region, with clear reason to want defensible refuges, than on any hard archaeological marker tying a specific tunnel to a specific Hittite date. Part of the problem is that carved rock doesn't carbon date the way charcoal or bone does. There's no organic material intrinsic to the act of cutting a passage through tuff, so any dating has to lean on whatever pottery, tools, or other datable debris happen to turn up inside a given room, which tells you plenty about who was last using that space and very little about who first opened it. What makes dating the rest of the complex so difficult is precisely the thing that made building it possible in the first place. Soft, endlessly workable tuff invites continuous digging rather than a single finished project. Unlike a monument raised once and then left alone, Derinkuyu appears to have been expanded, level by level, generation by generation, by whoever occupied the region at a given moment, with each community adding tunnels, rooms, and sometimes entire new levels onto whatever their predecessors had already carved. Byzantine Christians, centuries later, are credited with dramatically enlarging the complex, cutting the chapel, deepening existing shafts, and likely accounting for a substantial share of what a visitor walks through today, but they were building onto something that had already been growing, quietly, underground, for well over 1,000 years before they ever arrived. Derinkuyu, as impressive as it is on its own, turns out to be only one node in something considerably larger. A tunnel roughly 8 kilometers long connects it directly to Kaymaklı, another major underground city a short distance away, itself spread across multiple levels and built along broadly similar defensive principles: narrow choke points, sealable stone doors, ventilation shafts feeding rooms far below the surface. Researchers studying the wider Cappadocia region have identified as many as 200 separate underground settlements of varying scale scattered across the landscape, ranging from modest single-family shelters barely large enough to hide a household through a bad week, up to sprawling multi-level complexes on the scale of Derinkuyu and Kaymaklı themselves. And the honest truth is that most of these smaller sites have never been fully surveyed at all. Kaymaklı, for its own part, is no minor footnote. Its excavated levels, generally reckoned at around 4 to 8 depending on which sections are counted, house an estimated capacity running into the thousands, and its layout follows the same underlying logic as Derinkuyu's: narrow defensible corridors, ventilation shafts doing double duty as wells, storage and stables and communal rooms stacked according to the same practical priorities. What makes the wider regional picture even harder to pin down is that most of Cappadocia's smaller underground settlements sit, exactly as Derinkuyu once did, beneath towns and villages that are still very much lived in today, which means a meaningful share of whatever else is down there may currently be sitting under someone's kitchen floor, undiscovered for the same reason Derinkuyu itself stayed hidden for so long. Nobody has had a reason yet to knock down the right wall. That raises a genuinely open question that archaeologists working in the region still argue over: how much of this was ever actually connected? The tunnel to Kaymaklı proves that at least some of these underground cities were deliberately linked across real distance, and it's tempting, once you know that, to imagine a single sprawling subterranean network stretching beneath much of Cappadocia, one continuous world under the surface one. The evidence for that broader picture is frustratingly incomplete, partly because many connecting tunnels appear to have been deliberately collapsed or blocked at some point in the past, quite possibly a defensive choice by the people who used them, since a single breach that could compromise an entire network would have been a serious liability, worth sealing off even at the cost of losing the connection for good. If the idea of an entire hidden world under your feet, one whose full extent still isn't confirmed even now, is the kind of thing that keeps your mind quietly circling back, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because the reason all of this was built in the first place is where the story gets considerably darker. The clearest, best documented threat these cities were built and repeatedly rebuilt to survive came from the long, grinding series of Arab-Byzantine wars that swept through Anatolia between roughly the 7th and 10th century CE, as Umayyad and later Abbasid armies pushed deep into Byzantine territory in a cycle of seasonal raiding campaigns that lasted, on and off, for generations. Cappadocia sat close enough to the frontier, particularly near mountain passes like the Cilician gates that raiding armies used to move between Syria and the Anatolian plateau, that its villages faced these incursions with grim regularity, especially during a particularly intense stretch in the decades around 780 to 810 CE. When word came that raiders were approaching, entire communities appear to have simply vanished underground, taking their livestock and stored food with them, sealing the great stone doors behind them, and waiting, sometimes for what must have felt like an unbearably long stretch, for the danger to pass overhead and move on. Surface entrances were kept deliberately unremarkable, disguised where possible as nothing more than ordinary rock openings or modest storage cellars, so a raiding party riding through an apparently emptied village would have little obvious reason to suspect an entire underground city, and its entire population, sat directly beneath their horses' hooves. It's worth pausing on what that actually required psychologically as much as physically, generation after generation of families who knew, as a matter of routine rather than emergency, that survival sometimes meant leaving daylight behind entirely and trusting a system of stone doors and air shafts built by people who were long dead before disappearing underground themselves. The threat didn't end neatly with the Arab-Byzantine wars either. The region absorbed further waves of instability during Seljuk Turkish incursions in the 11th century and later disruption tied to Timur's campaigns in the early 15th century, and there's scattered evidence that communities kept the underground cities functional, in some reduced or localized form, as a fallback option whenever surface life in Cappadocia turned dangerous again. Not every reason to disappear underground came from outside the empire's own borders, either. During the 8th and 9th centuries CE, the Byzantine Empire tore itself apart internally over iconoclasm, a bitter, decades-long religious conflict over whether venerating painted and carved images of Christ and the saints was legitimate worship or outright idolatry, with emperors at various points ordering icons destroyed and their defenders punished. Cappadocia's soft rock landscape, already riddled with carved churches and monastic cells, became a haven for monks and religious communities caught on the losing side of that argument at any given moment, and it's a reasonable, if not perfectly documented, inference that some of the same underground complexes built to dodge Arab raiders also sheltered people hiding from their own empire's religious police rather than from any foreign army at all. The story finally comes back up to daylight, and to the modern edge of memory, through an event considerably more recent than any Arab raid or Mongol incursion. In 1923, under the terms of the Treaty of Lausanne, Turkey and Greece carried out a compulsory population exchange that uprooted roughly 1.2 million Greek Orthodox Christians from Anatolia, sending them to Greece in exchange for several 100,000 Muslims moving the other direction out of Greek territory. Cappadocia had held a substantial Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian population for centuries, communities with deep, specific, inherited knowledge of exactly which cellar led where, which shaft doubled as a well, which stone door sealed which corridor, and in 1923 nearly all of them were forced to leave, taking that lived, granular knowledge of the tunnels with them and leaving very little of it behind for whoever moved into their houses afterward. Accounts passed down from families on both sides of that exchange described the departure as something many people genuinely believed, or at least hoped, might be temporary, houses locked rather than abandoned outright, keys pressed into the hands of neighbors or left with local officials, small household items left in place as though someone might simply be back for them within the year. Nobody organizing that exchange was thinking about tunnel maps or well shafts. It was a sweeping, largely political population transfer negotiated over the heads of the people actually living it, and whatever specific, granular knowledge an individual family carried about which cellar in their own house connected to which corridor below almost certainly left with them, unrecorded, because there had never been any reason before that year to write it down. The population that resettled the region in the years that followed had no comparable inherited familiarity with the specific layout beneath their new homes, and over the following decades, entrances quietly collapsed, got built over by new construction, or simply slipped out of active use and then out of memory entirely, the way any space nobody deliberately maintains eventually does. By 1963, when that homeowner broke through his basement wall, the underground city beneath Derinkuyu wasn't ancient history in some abstract sense, it was something the town's own population, only a single population exchange removed from people who'd once known it intimately, had genuinely, collectively forgotten existed. Part of why Cappadocia saw wave after wave of exactly this kind of danger, century after century, comes down to simple geography. The plateau sits astride some of the oldest overland routes connecting Anatolia to Syria and Mesopotamia, a corridor armies, traders, and migrating peoples had been moving through for thousands of years before any Byzantine emperor or Arab caliph existed to fight over it. A region that valuable as a crossing point was never going to be left alone for long by anyone with an army capable of marching through it, which goes some way toward explaining why a single town might feel the need to keep expanding its underground refuge across the Phrygian era, the Byzantine centuries, the Seljuk period, and beyond, instead of building it once and considering the job finished. Derinkuyu opened partially to visitors in 1969, and it remains, even now, only partially open, with roughly half of the excavated complex accessible to the public and the rest closed off, either for safety reasons in unstable sections or because surveying work there is still ongoing. Today Derinkuyu draws visitors from across the world as part of the wider Cappadocia region, which built its modern tourism identity around its rock-cut churches, its cave hotels, and the hot air balloons that drift over the ferry chimneys at sunrise, a very different relationship with this landscape than the one held by the people who once carved 18 levels into it purely to survive. Cappadocia's rock-cut sites broadly fall under UNESCO World Heritage recognition centered on the Gorim region, and Derinkuyu itself has repeatedly been discussed for expanded formal protection, an official acknowledgement that what's underground here is every bit as significant, historically, as the painted churches and carved facades that get most of the postcard attention above ground. And the story of things still being found isn't finished either. In 2013, during a routine urban housing demolition project in Nevşehir, the provincial capital just a few kilometers from Derinkuyu, construction workers broke through into tunnels running beneath a hilltop castle, leading into yet another underground complex that some researchers who've examined the early surveys believe may turn out to be larger than Derinkuyu itself, though full excavation is still underway and its true scale hasn't been definitively established even now. Preliminary work at the Nevsur site has already turned up living spaces, escape tunnels, and lookout points cut into the rock beneath the old castle hill, and initial estimates floated by the archaeologists involved suggested it could eventually cover several times the footprint currently mapped at Derinkuyu, though those figures remain provisional and the pace of excavation has been slow, constrained by the fact that a living, modern town sits directly on top of the site, the same basic obstacle that kept Derinkuyu itself hidden for so many centuries. Nobody involved is yet willing to say for certain whether tunnels from the Nevsur complex actually reach far enough to connect with the known network running toward Derinkuyu and Kaymaklı, but the possibility hasn't been ruled out either, and it's exactly the kind of open question this region seems to keep generating faster than anyone can close it. So here's honestly where this one has to leave you. We know, with real confidence, roughly how this underground world worked: the ventilation, the water, the stone doors that could only be sealed from within, the stables and presses and kitchens that turned hiding into something closer to an entire alternate way of living. We know, at least in broad strokes, who kept adding to it and roughly why, generation after generation of people choosing to carve further into the dark rather than risk what waited on the surface. What we don't know, and quite possibly never will with any real precision, is how much of Cappadocia's underground world has actually been found, how many more entrances are still sitting sealed under some unremarkable house or hillside waiting for a wall to come down, or how long ago the very first hands, whoever they were, started cutting the very first room into that soft, forgiving volcanic stone. Every few years, somewhere in this same stretch of central Anatolia, another wall comes down, another basement renovation goes further than anyone expected, another construction crew hits open space where the blueprints said there should be solid ground, and the map of what's underneath this particular corner of the world quietly gets redrawn again. It happened in 1963. It happened again in 2013. There's no obvious reason, geologically or historically, to assume it won't happen again, somewhere under Cappadocia, sometime soon, to someone who has no idea yet that their ordinary house sits on top of something considerably older, and considerably stranger, than they currently think it does.